Long before the Czech Republic existed as a nation, the lands of Bohemia and Moravia were shaped by thousands of years of human movement, climate shifts, and cultural change. This region, nestled in the heart of Central Europe, became a crossroads for migrating peoples, each leaving behind traces of language, belief, and daily life. To understand how a modern Czech identity eventually formed, we first need to explore the distant past when early humans slowly turned these valleys and hills into a home. Archaeological evidence shows that human presence in Bohemia stretches back to the Paleolithic era. Groups of hunter-gatherers moved across the region during warmer periods, following herds of animals and settling near rivers where food and stone resources were available. As climate conditions changed, so did patterns of settlement. Warmer phases encouraged more stable communities, while colder periods forced groups to retreat or adapt. Over time, these early inhabitants established a rhythm with the land, shaping the earliest chapters of the region's human story. By the late Iron Age, Celtic tribes known as the Boii had become dominant across much of Central Europe, including what is now the western part of the Czech Republic. The very name Bohemia is rooted in their identity, a reminder that even ancient tribes could leave lasting marks on geography. The Boii built fortified settlements, worked with iron, and engaged in trade networks that stretched widely across the continent. Their influence helped integrate the region into the broader cultural and economic world of Iron Age Europe. The arrival of Germanic tribes marked the next significant shift. The Marcomanni and the Quadi, powerful Germanic groups, settled in and around Bohemia during the final centuries of the first millennium BCE. Under the leadership of kings such as Marabordius, the Marcomanni created a strong, centralized kingdom that interacted frequently with the Roman Empire to the south. Roman historians described these tribes with a mixture of respect and suspicion, noting their military strength and their strategic control of important territories. Although the Romans never fully conquered Bohemia, the region played a significant role in Roman diplomacy and conflict, influencing how power dynamics evolved along the empire's northern frontier. As centuries passed, the movements of peoples across Europe intensified. Climate pressures, shifting alliances, and the decline of Rome created a vast period of migration. The Germanic tribes began to move westward and southward, leaving space for new groups entering from the east. Among them were the early Slavs, whose arrival would redefine the ethnic and cultural character of the region. The Slavic migration into Bohemia and Moravia occurred gradually across the late 5th and early 6th centuries CE. These communities did not arrive as a single unified group. Instead, clusters of families and clans traveled along a river raw by fertile land, access to water, and opportunities for stable settlement. The Slavs brought with them a distinct language family, new agricultural practices, and social structures built around village life. They typically lived in small wooden dwellings, farmed the land, and kept livestock. Their societies were egalitarian compared to the more hierarchical structures of some neighboring cultures, and leadership often emerged through consensus or merit. One of the defining features of early Slavic culture in Bohemia was its adaptability. Rather than displacing all earlier communities, the Slavs absorbed remnants of the populations that remained. They learned from the landscape as well as from fragments of the cultures that preceded them. Their settlement patterns show a strong reliance on rivers, especially the Vltava, Elbe, and Morava, which provided not only water and transportation, but also fertile grounds for cultivation. As these communities grew, they established the foundations of what would later become recognizable Czech culture. By the early 7th century, these scattered Slavic groups began forming larger alliances. The pressures of external threats, especially from expanding tribes such as the Avars, encouraged cooperation. Slavic leaders organized defenses, built early fortifications, and strengthened ties among neighboring settlements. These developments marked important steps toward political cohesion. Although still far from a unified state, the region was transitioning from loosely connected villages into a more organized society capable of collective action. As the early Slavic communities in Bohemia became more organized, the region entered a transformative era. Villages were growing, alliances were strengthening, and leaders began to emerge who could guide larger groups of people through conflict, diplomacy, and cultural change. This moment marks the beginning of political history in the Czech lands, a period when legend and fact blend together to form the foundations of the first Bohemian state. At the heart of this transformation stands the Sicilid dynasty, a ruling family whose origins are rooted in myth but whose influence became unmistakably real. According to Czech tradition, the dynasty began with a humble plowman named Pisil, chosen as husband by the prophetess Libushi, who was said to have foreseen the future greatness of Prague. While historians treat these stories as symbolic, they capture an important truth. Early Bohemian leadership relied on both practical governance and a sense of shared identity, strengthened through stories that united the people. What matters historically is that around this time a hereditary leadership structure was forming in Bohemia. Stronger chiefs began to consolidate authority over neighboring settlements, creating early political centers. These leaders controlled trade routes, organized defenses, and often acted as judges or mediators. This was the environment in which the Semislids took shape as a powerful dynasty, capable of uniting the region. A crucial turning point came with the collapse of the powerful realm known as Great Moravia. During the late 9th and early 10th centuries, pressures from external groups, especially the Magyars, weakened and eventually destroyed this important Slavic state. The fall of Great Moravia left a political vacuum across Central Europe. While this collapse brought hardship to its former territories, it also created opportunities for neighboring regions to rise. Bohemia, protected by mountains and supported by growing internal cohesion, was well positioned to step forward. By this time, the Pislids were emerging as dominant leaders in Bohemia. Under their authority, the settlement of Prague developed into a central hub of power. Strategic trade routes ran through the region, particularly those connecting the Baltic world with the Mediterranean. Control of these routes brought wealth, influence, and the capacity to build more advanced political structures. One of the earliest premise rulers known from historical sources is Bohemond, remembered as the first Christian Duke of Bohemia. His baptism, traditionally linked to the influence of Cyril and Methodius from Great Moravia, played a pivotal role in the region's transformation. Christianity was not just a spiritual force. It was a political tool that connected Bohemia to the wider European world. Adopting Christianity aligned Bohemia with powerful neighbors and opened doors to diplomatic alliances, literacy, and new forms of legal authority. Bohemia's decision to embrace Christianity faced resistance at first as local traditions and spiritual practices ran deep. However, the Semislids rulers understood the long-term advantages that came with joining the Christian cultural sphere. Over time, Christian institutions spread across the land, churches were built, and foreign clergy helped establish new social and political norms. These developments strengthened the central authority of the Semislid family, who often sponsored these religious efforts as a way to legitimize their rule. As Christianity took root, the Sicilid state continued to grow through both diplomacy and military action. Leaders such as Boleslav the Cruel, whose name reflects his fierce reputation, expanded Bohemian territory and strengthened its political influence. His rule also marks the beginning of consistent documentation of Bohemian affairs by chroniclers in neighboring regions. Through these sources, historians trace Bohemia's increasing involvement with the powerful Holy Roman Empire. Bohemia existed in a complex relationship with this empire. On one hand, the empire sought to exert influence over Central European territories, expecting tribute or political loyalty. On the other hand, the Bohemian rulers skillfully navigated these pressures, seeking recognition when it offered advantages while resisting direct control. This delicate balance helped Bohemia maintain its identity and autonomy during a period when many smaller states were absorbed by larger powers. One major achievement of the Semislid rulers during this period was the consolidation of internal authority. Early medieval rulers often struggled to control distant regions where local nobles could defy central power. The Primelids worked to gradually bring these nobles under their influence, sometimes through force, sometimes through negotiation. Fortified hill forts known as gords became centers of regional administration and military organization. These fortifications symbolized the growing power of the Bohemian state and served as markers of semi-led authority. The construction of Prague Castle, which likely began in the late 9th century, stands as a clear expression of this rising central power. Positioned on a strategic hill above the Vltava River, it became the political heart of the Pislid administration. Settlements around the castle expanded, trade increased, and the foundations of the future city of Prague emerged. Over time, the castle would become one of the most important symbols of Czech history, representing centuries of continuity and statehood. The rise of the Szászlid dynasty also shaped cultural development in the region. As Christianity spread, so did literacy, primarily through the arrival of clergy who introduced Latin learning. Early churches and monasteries became centers not only of worship, but also of education and artistic expression. These institutions preserved knowledge, supported diplomacy, and contributed to the cultural distinctiveness of the emerging Bohemian state. Throughout this era, the balance between internal consolidation and external diplomacy defined Bohemia's progress. The Pistlids formed alliances through marriage with other noble families, strengthening ties across Central Europe. These connections helped the Bohemian state survive periods of conflict and navigate the shifting political landscape of the early medieval world. As the Szászlid dynasty strengthened its hold over Bohemia, the region entered a new phase of political and cultural development. Earlier generations had laid the groundwork by establishing leadership, building fortified centers, and adopting Christianity as a guiding framework. Now, during the 10th through the 12th centuries, these elements began to mature into stable institutions that shaped everyday life, diplomacy, and the identity of the emerging Bohemian state. This era marks the point when Bohemia transitioned from a loosely unified principality into a more structured realm recognized and respected by its neighbors. One of the most significant forces driving this transformation was the deepening Christian presence in the Czech lands. While the first steps toward conversion had been taken by earlier rulers, Christianity had not yet permeated society in a consistent way. To change this, the PISLs worked closely with church leaders to expand religious authority across the region. New churches arose in key settlements, and monasteries became centers of learning, administration, and cultural influence. The growing network of clergy introduced written Latin, developed record-keeping practices, and shaped legal traditions that supported the emerging state. A strong example of this cooperation can be seen in the establishment of the Prague bishopric. This institution provided spiritual leadership, but it also played a crucial political function. The bishopric helped organize parishes, collect tithes, and connect Bohemia more closely to the religious structures of Western Europe. This connection mattered deeply. Through the church, Bohemian leaders interacted with powerful figures such as the Holy Roman Emperors and the popes, positioning Bohemia as an integral part of the Christian world. Within this growing Christian order, the figure of Saint Weslaus stands out as a symbol of moral leadership and political aspiration. Though his life was cut short by internal conflict, his reputation as a just and pious ruler quickly spread beyond Bohemia's borders. His story, recounted in early chronicles lights the tension between traditional power structures and the emerging Christian moral authority. Over time, Saint Weslaus became a unifying figure representing the spiritual legitimacy of the PMI's line. His veneration strengthened the dynasty's claim that its rule was divinely supported, reinforcing stability during periods of political uncertainty. Another significant force in shaping this era was the changing relationship between the Bohemian rulers and the Holy Roman Empire. The Semi-Slids understood that managing this relationship was essential for preserving autonomy. They did not possess the military strength to challenge the empire directly, so they used diplomacy, negotiation, and strategic loyalty to maintain their position. In doing so, they secured titles, privileges, and recognition that enhanced their prestige and influence. The reign of Bolus I, often referred to as Bolus the Cruel, due to the harsh circumstances surrounding his rise to power, greatly strengthened the Bohemian state. He expanded the realm through military campaigns and developed a system of tribute that provided resources for administration and defense. Yet his most lasting accomplishment may have been turning Bohemia into an organized and disciplined principality, capable of acting as a reliable ally or a formidable opponent within the complex politics of Central Europe. For Lovisav, these efforts paved the way for his son Bolisav II, whose rule further transformed Bohemia. Under his leadership, the region became home to important religious institutions, such as the first monastery at Brevnov. Monastic communities played a major role in shaping culture, writing chronicles, and strengthening ties with the broader Christian world. They introduced agricultural methods that improved food production, allowing population growth and urban development. The combination of religious influence and economic expansion helped stabilize society and reinforced Bohemia's standing among European states. During this period, Prague continued to grow as a political and cultural center. Its location along major trade routes made it a natural meeting point for merchants, craftsmen, and diplomats. Goods from the east and west exchanged hands in Prague's markets, and foreign visitors brought knowledge of new technologies, artistic traditions, and political ideas. The PMESDs recognized the value of this exchange and invested in strengthening the city's defenses, expanding its settlement areas, and developing an administrative structure capable of governing a growing urban population. One of the most important outcomes of this era was the formation of a more unified legal system. As Christianity spread, church law influenced civil practices. Courts began to follow standardized procedures, and written records helped ensure consistency in judgments. These developments strengthened the authority of the duke, who relied on legal structures to manage disputes among nobles, enforce agreements, and maintain stability. The growing use of written documents also allowed rulers to issue charters that granted rights to towns, monasteries, or noble families. These charters played a key role in shaping social hierarchy and landholding patterns. The growth of noble power was another defining feature of this period. The Pelids depended on influential families to govern outlying regions, provide military support, and administer justice. In return, nobles received land, privileges, and important positions within the court. This arrangement created a delicate balance. While nobles contributed to the state's strength, they also held the potential to challenge central authority. The Shimslades had to manage these relationships carefully, rewarding loyalty while preventing the rise of rivals who could threaten stability. Foreign policy also evolved significantly during this era. Bohemian rulers participated in imperial campaigns, joined diplomatic councils, and contributed to broader political strategies within the empire. These actions increased their visibility and influence. At the same time, they cultivated alliances with neighboring Poland and Hungary when circumstances allowed, creating counterweights to imperial pressure. This blend of strategic flexibility and cautious engagement helped ensure that Bohemia retained its autonomy while benefiting from connections to powerful states. By the late 12th century, the Pislid dynasty had established itself as the unquestioned ruling power in Bohemia. The region was no longer a frontier territory struggling to define its identity. Instead, it was a growing principality that sought recognition, influence, and stability in a competitive European landscape. This era marks a turning point, the gradual elevation of Bohemia from a principality to a recognized kingdom, along with an expansion of political ambitions, economic prosperity, and architectural achievement. The developments of these centuries would shape the future character of the Czech lands and strengthen Bohemia's position in the broader medieval world. A key figure at the beginning of this transformation was Pisil Otakar. His political skill, determination, and strategic sense helped secure Bohemia's elevation to a hereditary kingdom. Earlier rulers had occasionally raised a royal title from the Holy Roman Emperors, but these grants were temporary and could be withdrawn. Shmaisel Otakar sought something more durable, a permanent, legally recognized royal status that would strengthen the dynasty and stabilize the realm. Through careful diplomacy, he achieved this goal. He supported the imperial cause during a period of contested succession within the Holy Roman Empire, aligning himself with the leaders most likely to grant him favorable terms. In return for his loyalty, he secured the Golden Bull of Sicily, a foundational charter that confirmed the hereditary royal title for the Pislids. This charter, issued in the early 13th century, marked the moment when Bohemia became a kingdom recognized by the strongest political authorities in Europe. It was a remarkable achievement, one that demonstrated both the rising influence of Bohemia and the diplomatic intelligence of its ruler. The new royal status strengthened internal authority as well. With a legally recognized crown, the PMI's rulers could more effectively manage noble families, define succession rules, and implement stable governance. Local nobles still held significant power, but royal prestige provided leverage that helped resolve disputes and maintain unity during times of political tension. The monarchy also developed stronger administrative systems, including expanded courts and formalized land agreements that shaped economic relations throughout the kingdom. The birth of the Bohemian Kingdom coincided with broader transformations across Central Europe. Advances in agriculture, such as improved plowing techniques and the expansion of arable land, supported population growth. This increase in population stimulated the founding of towns, many of which soon became centers of trade, craft production, and taxation. Merchants brought new goods into the region, including fabrics, metals, and imported luxury items that reflected the kingdom's growing wealth. These towns benefited from royal charters that granted special rights, encouraging economic development and attracting settlers from both within and beyond Bohemia's borders. The growth of trade and urban life was particularly visible in Prague, which continued to evolve into one of the most important cities in the region. Its central position along major trade routes allowed it to act as a bridge between Eastern and Western Europe. German merchants settled in the city, contributing economic expertise and strengthening connections with markets across the empire. This mixture of cultural influences helped shape Prague into a cosmopolitan medieval city, one that reflected both Czech and broader European traditions. While Przemysl Otakar laid the foundation for Bohemia as a kingdom, his successors built upon that foundation to expand its influence even further. Among the most notable rulers of this era was Przemysl Otakar II, often called the Iron and Golden King. His reign marked the high point of Přemyslid power, characterized by territorial ambition, economic expansion, and impressive achievements in statecraft. Otakar II sought to extend Bohemia's control beyond its traditional borders. Through a combination of military campaigns and strategic marriages, he acquired territories stretching from the Danube to the Adriatic coast. His expanding realm connected Bohemia to important trade routes and provided access to new resources. These efforts reflected an ambitious vision. He aimed to transform Bohemia into one of the leading powers of Central Europe. Under his rule, the kingdom experienced significant internal development. Many towns received formal charters, which encouraged immigration and stimulated economic growth. Gothic architectural styles began to appear. Inspired by trends emerging from France and Germany, stone castles rose across the countryside, symbolizing both royal authority and the increasing wealth of noble families. Monasteries continued to produce manuscripts, promote education, and preserve cultural traditions, reinforcing the kingdom's intellectual life. Przemysł otakar also invested in mining, an industry that would later become central to Bohemia's economy. Silver and other minerals from Czech mines provided substantial revenue, enabling the ruler to maintain large armies and sponsor ambitious building projects. This economic strength enhanced the kingdom's regional influence and supported its diplomatic activities. Despite these successes, the expanding ambitions of Czesław Otakar II brought him into conflict with powerful rivals, most notably the rising Habsburg dynasty. When the Holy Roman Empire elected Rudolf of Habsburg as emperor, Czesław Otakar II refused to recognize Rudolf's authority, believing that his influence justified a larger role in imperial leadership. This disagreement escalated into open conflict. After several years of political struggle and shifting alliances, Przemysł Otakar II faced Rudolf's forces in battle. His defeat marked a turning point. Although the Semicid dynasty retained the Bohemian throne, much of the territory gained during his reign was lost. Even so, the legacy of Przemysł Otakar II remained profound. His reign demonstrated the potential of Bohemia to act as a major regional power. He strengthened the economic base of the kingdom, encouraged urban development, and promoted architectural and cultural growth. His rule also highlighted the challenges of navigating the complex political environment of medieval Europe, where rising dynasties and shifting alliances constantly reshaped borders and power structures. The end of his reign opened a period of adjustment as the kingdom sought stability after years of territorial expansion and conflict. The Hussite dynasty continued to rule, but the pressures of internal rivalries and external influences demanded careful leadership. During these years, the monarchy worked to consolidate the core territories of Bohemia, Moravia, and parts of Silesia, ensuring that the kingdom would remain strong even without the broader holdings once pursued by Przemysł Otakar II. This era also witnessed the continued rise of Prague as an intellectual and spiritual center. Cathedrals, churches, and monasteries flourished, attracting scholars and artisans. The city's architectural landscape began to reflect the growing sophistication of the kingdom, with early Gothic elements blending into existing structures. These developments would later pave the way for even greater cultural achievements under the Luxembourgs across Bohemia. The interactions between nobles, clergy, townspeople, and royal administrators created a dynamic social fabric. The kingdom's legal system matured, incorporating both customary practices and new written statutes. Landholding patterns became more defined, shaping the economic relationships that supported the monarchy. Roads and trade routes improved, facilitating communication and commerce. In many ways, this period represented the transition from early medieval structures to a more advanced and interconnected society. With the end of the Przemysl dynasty, the Bohemian throne entered a period of uncertainty. The demise of its long-ruling family left a vacuum that European powers eagerly sought to fill. Yet out of this moment of instability emerged one of the most remarkable eras in Czech history. The Luxembourg family, through a series of political arrangements and marriages, rose to control the Bohemian crown. Under their leadership, the kingdom entered a golden age of cultural brilliance, architectural achievement, and political influence unmatched in its earlier centuries. At the center of this transformation was a ruler whose legacy continues to shape Czech identity today: Charles IV. The Luxembourg dynasty gained its foothold in Bohemia through the marriage of John of Luxembourg to Elizabeth of the Przemysl line. Elizabeth was the sister of the last male Przemysl ruler, and her marriage secured the legitimacy needed for a new dynasty to rule. John of Luxembourg, often called John the Blind, came from a prominent noble family deeply involved in the politics of the Holy Roman Empire. His arrival brought Bohemia into a wider European political network, strengthening diplomatic ties and elevating the kingdom's prominence. Although respected as a knight and admired for his chivalrous spirit, John the Blind spent relatively little time in Bohemia. Much of his life was devoted to military campaigns and diplomatic missions across Europe. His passion for warfare and courtly culture made him a celebrated figure in France and the Empire. But his absence left the administration of Bohemia in the hands of local nobles. This situation created both opportunities and challenges. While some nobles enjoyed increased influence, others worried about the stability of the kingdom and the lack of direct royal oversight. John's most important contribution to Bohemia, however, was not his personal rule, but his son, who would become one of the greatest European monarchs of the medieval era. Born in Prague and raised partly in France, the future Charles IV received an exceptional education. He learned languages, theology, law, and diplomacy, preparing him for leadership in a complex and interconnected world. His upbringing combined French courtly refinement with a deep understanding of Bohemian culture, giving him a unique ability to bridge traditions and govern with extraordinary insight. When Charles returned to Bohemia as a young leader, he brought with him a powerful vision for the kingdom's future. His goal was to transform Prague into a political, cultural, and intellectual center worthy of European admiration. To accomplish this, he engaged in a sweeping program of reforms, constructions, and administrative changes that reshaped the kingdom from the ground up. Charles IV became King of Bohemia and later Holy Roman Emperor, positions that allowed him to elevate the Czech lands to unprecedented heights. As king, he strengthened central authority by organizing a more efficient administration, reforming laws, and standardizing government practices. He issued a new law code known as the Mesters Carolina, which aimed to limit the power of rebellious nobles and ensure the stability of the monarchy. Although nobles resisted parts of the law code, the reforms demonstrated Charles's commitment to a strong and orderly state. One of his most enduring achievements was the founding of Charles University in Prague, the first university established in Central Europe. Modeled after institutions in Paris and Bologna, it became a center for theology, law, philosophy, and the arts. The university attracted scholars from across Europe and contributed to the intellectual growth of the Czech lands. For the first time, Prague became not just a political capital, but also a beacon of learning and cultural exchange. This institution would later play a key role in religious and philosophical debates, influencing Czech history for centuries to come. Architecture flourished under Charles's rule as well. He undertook ambitious building projects that reshaped Prague's skyline and cemented its status as a European metropolis. Construction began on the iconic Charles Bridge, which replaced an older structure destroyed by a flood. The bridge served not only as a vital connection across the Vltava River, but also as a symbol of royal authority and artistic achievement. Its statues and stonework reflected both religious devotion and political prestige. Charles also continued work on the great Cathedral of St. Vitus at Prague Castle, inviting prominent architects from France and Germany to enhance the Gothic design. The cathedral became one of the most important spiritual and artistic monuments in the region. Beyond its religious significance, it housed royal coronations, stored sacred relics, and served as a powerful representation of the kingdom's cultural maturity. In addition to these projects, Charles reimagined Prague's urban layout by establishing the new town, a district designed with wide streets, large squares, and planned markets. This expansion reflected not only population growth, but also the king's desire to showcase Prague as a modern, well-organized city. The new town attracted merchants, craftsmen, and scholars, reinforcing the kingdom's economic vitality. Charles IV also strengthened Bohemia's economic position by expanding mining operations, particularly silver production in Cahora. This wealth enabled the monarchy to invest further in cultural and political initiatives, minting coins, overseeing trade, and managing taxation, all supported by mineral wealth, allowed Bohemia to become one of the most prosperous regions in the empire. Diplomatically, Charles was equally successful. He secured territorial gains, negotiated important alliances, and cultivated a reputation as a wise and thoughtful ruler. His reign brought stability to Central Europe and strengthened the position of the Holy Roman Empire. By balancing the interests of nobles, bishops, and imperial princes, he maintained order and prevented many of the internal conflicts that plagued other medieval states. His influence extended beyond political boundaries. Charles was known for his piety, sponsoring religious institutions, collecting relics, and shaping church policy. His spiritual devotion enhanced his reputation as a righteous king, and his relationship with the church ensured strong support for many of his initiatives. Yet he also maintained a pragmatic approach, understanding the need to balance religious ideals with political realities. One of his most significant contributions to European governance came when he issued the Golden Bull as emperor. This document clarified the procedures for imperial elections, reducing disputes among the electors and strengthening the electors and structure of the Holy Roman Empire. Although this reform primarily addressed imperial matters, it further showcased the legal and administrative talent of a ruler whose influence stretched across Central Europe. The death of Charles IV marked the end of a golden era for the Bohemian kingdom. Although his successors inherited a prosperous and influential realm, they lacked his political skill, diplomatic balance, and unifying vision. As a result, the fabric of society gradually shifted, economic pressures increased, foreign influence grew stronger, and social divisions widened. Within this landscape, new religious debates emerged. Debates that would eventually transform not only Bohemia, but the entire Christian world. Central to this transformation was a preacher and scholar whose message challenged powerful institutions and spoke directly to the frustrations of ordinary people. Jan Hus. To understand the rise of Jan Hus, it is essential to consider the religious climate of Europe during the late 14th and early 15th centuries. The Christian Church, once seen as the unquestioned guardian of spiritual truth, faced growing criticism. Many believers were troubled by the wealth of the clergy, the sale of indulgences, and the corruption that affected church administration. These concerns were not unique to Bohemia, but in the Czech lands, they took on a particularly intense form because of deep social inequalities, rising national consciousness, and tensions between Czech and German populations. The University of Prague, founded by Charles IV, became a center of these intellectual and religious debates. Its scholars discussed theology, philosophy, and the nature of church authority, drawing on ideas circulating throughout Europe. Among these ideas, the writings of the English reformer John Wycliffe gained special attention. Wycliffe questioned the privileges of the clergy and argued for a return to the simplicity of early Christianity. He emphasized the authority of Scripture and criticized practices he believed strayed from Christ's teachings. His message resonated strongly in Bohemia, where many felt that religious institutions had become distant from the concerns of ordinary believers. Into this environment stepped Jan Hus, a priest educated at the University of Prague. H was not only a scholar, but a gifted preacher known for his clarity, conviction, and deep concern for moral reform. He served at Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, a church dedicated to preaching in the Czech language rather than Latin. Speaking in the language of the people allowed H to connect with audiences who often felt excluded from religious life. He criticized the moral failings of the clergy, called for greater humility within the church, and urged believers to focus on Scripture as their ultimate guide. Hus carved a unique position for himself by blending theological insight with social awareness. He addressed issues that affected daily life, such as the exploitation of peasants, the misuse of church authority, and the growing gap between wealthy prelates and struggling communities. His sermons were not inflammatory. Rather, they were earnest appeals for reform grounded in Christian ethics, yet their impact was powerful. Ordinary people admired him. Students supported him, and many nobles saw him as a champion of justice. At the same time, H faced growing opposition, especially from church leaders aligned with conservative or pro-German factions. These groups viewed his teachings as a threat to established authority. They feared that questioning the church hierarchy could undermine the entire social order. The tension between these camps intensified when the Western Schism divided the Church into competing papal factions. Different rulers supported different popes, and the conflict created widespread confusion about where true religious authority resided. H argued that moral truth did not depend on political allegiance or papal claims, but on the teachings of Christ. Such ideas placed him at odds with church officials who demanded loyalty to their appointed leaders. The debate escalated when Jan Hus criticized the sale of indulgences sanctioned by one of the rival popes. H argued that forgiveness could not be purchased, and that church leaders who promoted these sales were acting contrary to the spirit of Christianity. His bold stance attracted widespread support among the Czech population, but also deepened church hostility toward him. When he refused to retract his criticisms, he was excommunicated and forbidden to preach. Despite this, many nobles protected him, believing that his cause reflected broader demands for justice and reform. The conflict soon reached a point where religious debate could no longer be separated from national sentiment. German scholars within the university sought to limit Czech influence, leading to disputes over voting rights within the institution. When a reform gave Czech scholars a stronger position, many German academics left Prague. This exodus heightened ethnic tensions and left H as one of the most prominent intellectual voices in the kingdom. The Church's efforts to silence H did not succeed. Instead, they increased his visibility. As tensions grew, he agreed to appear before the Council of Constance, an international gathering intended to resolve the Church schism and address charges of heresy. He believed he would be allowed to defend his views openly. However, upon arrival, he was arrested and imprisoned, despite guarantees of safe conduct. His trial focused not only on his own teachings, but also on the influence of Wycliffe's writings, which the council sought to suppress. The execution of Jan Hus did not quiet the tensions within Bohemia. Instead, it ignited them. The moment news of his death reached Prague, something profound shifted in the hearts of the Czech people. H had spoken for reform, justice, and moral integrity, and many felt his execution at the hands of a distant council was not only a religious injustice, but an attack on the dignity of the Bohemian kingdom itself. What followed was a period unlike anything Europe had yet seen, an era of social revolution, military innovation, and a fierce struggle over the soul of a nation. The Hussite Wars would reshape Bohemia and influence the trajectory of European history for generations. In the months after Hus's execution, Bohemia fractured along ideological lines. Hus's followers, now known as Hussites, demanded sweeping changes within the church. They were not a single unified group, but a movement with diverse aims. Some called for moderate reforms, such as communion in both kinds, bread and wine for all believers, not just the clergy. Others held far more radical ideas, challenging not only the authority of the church, but also the social inequalities that had defined medieval society. These tensions soon spilled over into violence. The spark came when a prominent reform-minded priest, Jan Galski, delivered a fiery sermon in Prague, condemning the moral failings of church officials and the crown's efforts to suppress reform. His followers, inspired and angry, clashed with authorities. The confrontatio culminated in a dramatic act known as the First Defenestration of Prague, in which angry citizens threw several city council members out of the windows of the new town hall. Although these officials survived the fall, the act symbolized the breakdown of traditional authority and marked the beginning of open rebellion. As unrest spread, reform-minded nobles, townspeople, and peasants mobilized across the kingdom. Many gathered in the region of Tabor, a stronghold named after Mount Tabor from the Bible, symbolizing their belief that they were building a community modeled on spiritual purity and equality. The Taborites, as they became known, advocated for sweeping social and theological changes. They rejected the wealth of the church, criticized earthly power, and called for a more direct relationship between believers and God. Meanwhile, a more moderate faction, later called the Utraquists, remained centered in Prague and sought reform without overturning the entire social structure. The rising influence of these groups alarmed both the Catholic Church and European rulers. The Holy Roman Emperor, who was also the King of Bohemia, viewed the Hussite movement as a direct threat to imperial authority. The Church, still reeling from internal divisions, feared that Hussite teachings would inspire widespread dissent across Europe. In response, the Pope called for a crusade to crush the Hussite movement. Armies from across Europe began marching toward Bohemia, expecting a quick victory over what they viewed as a disorganized rebellion. Yet, the Hussites were anything but disorganized. Under the leadership of Jan Žižka, a veteran soldier and brilliant tactician, they developed a revolutionary approach to warfare. Žižka, who had lost sight in one eye and later became completely blind, possessed an extraordinary mind for military strategy. He transformed common Wago ends into mobile fortresses, creating defensive formations that could withstand cavalry charges and surprise attacks. These war wagons were equipped with small cannons, crossbowmen, and infantry, forming a flexible battlefield tactic that stunned Crusader forces unused to such innovation. The Hussites also trained their followers with remarkable discipline. Peasants, townsmen, and even women took part in defensive preparations, turning ordinary people into effective soldiers. Their unity and purpose gave them an advantage over Crusader armies made up of nobles and mercenaries, with less cohesion. The combination of new tactics, motivated troops, and strong leadership allowed the Hussites to win battles that European observers believed impossible. The first crusading army to enter Bohemia retreated in humiliation after encountering the fierce Hussite resistance. In subsequent years, additional crusades were launched. Yet, time and again, Hussite forces prevailed. Their victories sent shock waves across Europe. Chroniclers described how armies equipped with traditional medieval weaponry were unable to breach Hussite defenses or withstand their innovative battlefield maneuvers. The success of the Hittites demonstrated that military power did not depend solely on noble knights or heavy cavalry, but could be reshaped by strategy, technology, and collective determination. However, the Hussite movement faced internal strains even as it defeated external enemies. The Taborites and Utraquists differed not only in theology, but in their visions for society. The Taborites pushed for radical equality and rejected many church traditions outright, while the Utraquists sought reform within a more structured framework. These divisions threatened the unity needed to resist foreign intervention. Hussey's legacy had inspired both groups, yet their interpretations of his message varied significantly. Despite these internal tensions, the Hussites remained capable of defending Bohemia. At times, Žižka attempted to bridge the divide, urging cooperation and reminding followers of their shared purpose. After his death, which occurred due to illness rather than battle, leadership passed to figures such as Prokop the Great, who continued to guide the movement with skill and determination. Under Prokop's command, Hussite armies not only defended Bohemian territory, but also launched raids into neighboring lands. These campaigns, known as beautiful raids by Hussites and deeply feared by their enemies, demonstrated that the movement was no longer simply defensive. Hussite forces reached parts of Hungary, Saxony, and Austria, emphasizing their military capabilities and the failure of repeated crusades to contain them. Yet, the cost of prolonged conflict weighed heavily on Bohemia. Economic strain, destruction of farmland, and the burdens of continuous warfare created hardships for ordinary people. As the years passed, fatigue grew. Moderate groups began seeking negotiation rather than continued fighting. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church recognized that military force alone would not defeat the movement. A new approach became necessary. This shift led to the Council of Basel, where representatives from both sides entered negotiations. The Utraquists, representing the moderate Hussites, agreed to compromise on key theological issues. They secured recognition of their right to receive communion in both kinds, a central demand since the time of Hussite. In return, they accepted the authority of the Church in certain matters and acknowledged the need for unity within Christendom. Although not all Hussites supported these terms, the agreement known as the Basel Compacts represented a major step toward peace. The radical Taborites rejected the compromise, insisting on broader reforms. This disagreement culminated in a decisive confrontation at the Battle of Lipany, where Utraquist forces allied with Catholic nobles. The Taborites were defeated, bringing an end to their influence and marking the close of the most intense phase of the Hussite Wars. With their military power broken, the radical faction could no longer shape the future of Bohemia. The aftermath of the Hussite Wars reshaped the kingdom's political and religious landscape. Bohemia became the only region in Europe where a form of non-Catholic Christianity was legally permitted long before the Protestant Reformation swept across the continent. The Czech lands adopted a unique religious identity that blended tradition with reform, reflecting the legacy of Jan Hus and the sacrifices of those who had fought in his name. The end of the Hussite Wars left Bohemia transformed but unsettled. The kingdom had survived intense internal divisions and repeated foreign invasions, yet the cost of conflict weighed heavily on society. Fields had been damaged, trade weakened, and trust between religious and political factions remained fragile. Still, out of this exhaustion came the widespread desire for stability. The question now was how to govern a land shaped by radical ideas, diverse religious beliefs, and a newly empowered nobility. The answer arrived in the form of a new dynasty, the Jagiellonians. The Jagiellonians family came from the powerful Polish-Lithuanian world, a region that had grown in the powerful Polish-Lithuanian world, a region that had grown in influential through shrewd diplomacy and vast territorial expansion. Their rise had been propelled by King Władysław II Jagiellon of Poland, whose descendants would shape Central European politics for decades. When the Bohemian throne became vacant, many nobles saw the Jagiellonians as suitable rulers who could bring a measure of neutrality to a kingdom exhausted by ideological confrontation. The election of Władysław, later known as Władysław II, in Bohemia, marked a significant transition. Unlike the fierce religious polarization that had defined earlier decades, the Jagiellonian era sought reconciliation. Władysław inherited a realm where Utraquist beliefs remained widespread, yet Catholic institutions still claimed authority. Rather than attempt to impose a single religious vision, he pursued compromise. His reign embodied a pragmatic approach, maintained peace by allowing diversity as long as it did not threaten political stability. This strategy succeeded in lowering tensions that had fueled past conflicts. Utraquist priests continued to serve their congregations. Catholic bishops retained their positions, and radical factions had largely faded from influence after their defeat. While the arrangement was not free of friction, it allowed Bohemia to function without the violent sectarian clashes that had defined the Hussite era. This religious coexistence was unusual in a Europe that still expected uniformity of belief, and it gave the Czech lands a distinct identity within the Christian world. Yet peace brought its own challenges. The monarchy of Władysław II was deliberately cautious, emphasizing mediation rather than authority. As a result, noble families gained considerable power. The monarchy relied heavily on their cooperation, granting privileges and autonomy in exchange for political loyalty. Over time, this contributed to a decentralization of authority. Nobles managed their own territories with increasing independence, oversaw local justice, and expanded their wealth through land holdings. Towns, too, gained influence, especially those that had prospered from trade or mining. This growing power of the nobility reshaped Bohemian politics. The kingdom's diet or assembly became an arena where nobles could negotiate laws, taxa, change, and the broader direction of governance. While this system helped ensure that diverse voices were heard, it also limited the strength of the monarchy. A delicate balance emerged. The king presided over agreements, but the noble estates shaped much of the kingdom's daily administration. This shift in power marked a transition from centralized medieval monarchy toward something closer to a constitutional model, though without the formal structures that modern systems possess. Meanwhile, the Jagiellonian rulers also faced pressures from outside Bohemia. The Holy Roman Empire continued to view the Czech lands as a territory within its sphere of influence. Hungary too sought alliances and advantage in the region. To navigate this environment, Vladislaus relied heavily on diplomacy rather than confrontation. His calm temperament and willingness to compromise earned him the nickname King Bennett, meaning king well, because he often responded with a gentle, approving well. While some praised his peaceful approach, others criticized his reluctance to assert stronger authority. Despite these political challenges, Bohemia experienced cultural and economic growth during the Jagiellonian period. Mining, especially silver mining in Cahora, continued to prosper, bringing wealth into the region. This prosperity supported the rise of new building projects, artistic works, and scholarly activities. Although not as ambitious as the architectural legacy of Charles IV, the Jagiellonian era contributed to the Gothic and early Renaissance character of Czech towns. Churches were restored, town halls expanded, and castles refurbished, reflecting a society cautiously rebuilding after decades of turmoil. Education and intellectual life also experienced renewed vitality. The University of Prague remained an important center of learning, though it was still shaped by the divisions of decades, scholars debated philosophy, law, and theology, often drawing on both Catholic and Utriquist perspectives. This atmosphere of intellectual plurality made Bohemia unique within Europe, where universities typically aligned tightly with a single religious doctrine. One of the most distinctive cultural developments of this era was the growing sense of Czech identity. The earlier conflicts had reinforced the use of the Czech language in worship, administration, and literature. During the Jagiellonian period, Czech writings flourished. Chronicles, religious texts, and poems reflected the concerns of a society negotiating its place within a shifting political and religious landscape. This cultural vitality helped preserve Czech language and heritage at a time when German influence was spreading in many Central European towns. As Vladislaus aged, his rule became increasingly connected to the broader Jagiellonian ambitions across Europe. He eventually inherited the throne of Hungary, creating a personal union that linked the Czech and Hungarian kingdoms under one monarch. This development broadened Bohemia's political horizons, but also increased the demands placed on the king. Governing two large realms meant Vladislaus spent much of his time outside Prague, mirroring the earlier absenteeism of John the Blind. Once again, the Czech nobles operated with substantial autonomy, shaping local policies and maintaining regional stability. The death of Louis II changed the course of Bohemian history. His passing brought an abrupt end to the Jagiellonian dynasty, leaving the thrones of both Bohemia and Hungary without an heir. In the wake of this crisis, the Bohemian nobles faced a pivotal decision, choosing a ruler who could protect their kingdom at a moment of growing danger. The Ottoman Empire was advancing deeper into Central Europe, and the political landscape was shifting rapidly. Into this uncertainty stepped Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother-in-law to the late king and a member of a dynasty that was quickly becoming one of the most powerful families in Europe. By electing Ferdinand as king, the Bohemian nobility aligned themselves with a dynasty that controlled vast territories stretching from Spain to the Alps and beyond. At first glance, this seemed a strategic choice. The Habsburgs could offer military protection and diplomatic strength at a time when Bohemia needed both. Yet, this decision carried consequences that few could fully predict. The arrival of the Habsburgs marked the beginning of a long and complex relationship, one characterized by periods of cooperation, tension, and ultimately conflict. Ferdinand's approach to governance differed sharply from the Jagiellonian tradition where Vladislaus II and Louis II had relied on compromise with the Bohemian estates. Ferdinand believed in strengthening royal authority. He sought to centralize power, reduce the political independence of nobles, and bring religious uniformity to a kingdom marked by Utriquist beliefs and lingering Hussite traditions. Many nobles, especially those shaped by Bohemia's long history of religious plurality, resisted these efforts. Still, Ferdinand faced challenges that demanded immediate attention. The Ottoman threat to Hungary was severe, and defending the eastern frontier consumed much of his resources. This reality forced him to rely on Bohemian support, often requiring negotiations with the very nobles whose autonomy he hoped to limit. Yet, even as Ferdinand attempted to consolidate authority, he respected certain rights of the Bohemian estates, largely because he needed their cooperation against external enemies. Despite these tensions, the early Habsburg period brought administrative changes that strengthened the monarchy's long-term position. Royal councils were restructured, taxation systems refined, and efforts made to integrate Bohemia more firmly into the broader Habsburg political network. While these reforms created friction with the estates, they also established administrative foundations that would shape the kingdom for centuries. Religious tensions, however, grew steadily. The Catholic Church expected the Habsburgs, staunch defenders of Catholicism, to promote religious unity across their realms. Yet Bohemia retained a large Utriquist population, along with other emerging Protestant groups, influenced by the broader Reformation sweeping through Europe. These developments produced a complicated religious landscape. Catholic bishops held traditional authority, but Protestant beliefs were deeply embedded in society, especially among nobles and townspeople. Ferdinand's attempts to restore Catholic dominance met with resistance. Bohemian nobles were determined to preserve the religious freedoms they had gained since the Hussite Wars. Many saw the king's efforts not simply as religious measures, but as part of a larger attempt to undermine their authority. Over the years, this tension simmered beneath the surface, creating a climate of suspicion that would eventually erupt into open conflict. Economically, Bohemia remained significant within the Habsburg realm. Its silver mines, agricultural productivity, and emerging industries provided revenue that the monarchy relied upon. Prague and other towns continued to flourish as centers of trade and craftsmanship. However, the kingdom's prosperity did not translate into political leverage. The Habsburgs increasingly treated Bohemia as part of a greater imperial strategy rather than as an autonomous realm with its own traditions. The reign of Ferdinand's successor, Maximilian of Habsburg, continued these patterns. Maximilian was more tolerant than his father, and he pursued policies aimed at easing religious tensions. Yet even he was pressured by Catholic forces within the empire to limit Protestant influence. Although he avoided drastic measures, the underlying conflict remained unresolved. Bohemia's religious diversity persisted, but so did Habsburg ambitions for uniformity. The situation shifted dramatically with the accession of Rudolf of Habsburg, often known as Rudolf II. Rudolf chose Prague as his primary residence, transforming the city into the imperial capital for a time. Under his reign, Bohemia experienced a cultural and scientific renaissance. Artists, scholars, astronomers, and alchemists gathered at Rudolf's court, bringing new ideas and fostering a vibrant intellectual atmosphere. Figures such as Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler conducted groundbreaking research in Prague, and the city became known for its creative and scientific dynamism. Yet Rudolf's reign, despite its cultural brilliance, was marked by political instability. He struggled with mental health issues and often withdrew from public affairs. As a result, decision-making became erratic and tensions between Catholics and Protestants intensified. The Protestant estates demanded guarantees of religious freedom, fearing that Habsburg authority would eventually suppress their practices. After years of pressure, Rudolf issued the Letter of Majesty, a document granting significant religious rights to the Bohemian estates and recognizing their ability to manage their own churches and schools. The Letter of Majesty provided temporary peace, but it also weakened Rudolf's authority. His brother Matthias took advantage of the situation, challenging Rudolf's power and ultimately forcing him to surrender control of several Habsburg territories. When Matthias became king of Bohemia, he inherited a kingdom where divisions were deep and trust in royal authority was fragile. Matthias attempted to maintain the balance established by the Letter of Majesty, but Catholic advisors gained increasing influence at his court. Protestant nobles feared that their rights were once again at risk as Matthias aged and became unable to govern effectively. The question of succession created further uncertainty. The Habsburgs designated Ferdinand of Styria, later known as Ferdinand II, as the next king. Ferdinand was a devout Catholic with a strong commitment to restoring Catholic unity throughout the empire. His election signaled a return to policies that Protestant nobles viewed as unacceptable. The Second Defenestration of Prague, in which Protestant nobles hurled two royal governors and their secretary from a window of the Prague castle, marked a dramatic escalation of tensions that had been building for decades. What began as a symbolic act of protest soon spiraled into one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, the 30 Years' War. For Bohemia, this conflict was not merely another political struggle, but a turning point that reshaped its society, culture, and political destiny for centuries to come. The immediate aftermath of the defenestration made clear that compromise was no longer possible. Protestant nobles, convinced that their rights guaranteed by the Letter of Majesty were being violated, moved quickly to establish an alternative political order. They created a provisional government and formed a military force to defend their cause. In an even bolder step, they rejected the authority of Ferdinand the Mexid, whom they believed was committed to eliminating their religious freedoms. Instead, they elected a new king, Frederick of the Palatinate, often called the Winter King. Frederick came from a prominent Protestant family in the Holy Roman Empire and was married to the daughter of the English king. His election symbolized Bohemia's intent to align itself with a broader Protestant alliance. Supporters hoped this would secure international aid and strengthen resistance against the Habsburgs. However, Frederick's reign began under difficult circumstances. He arrived in Prague, full of optimism, but he faced a kingdom divided by religious, political, and regional differences. Many nobles supported the revolt, yet others hesitated, uncertain whether foreign powers would truly intervene on their behalf. The Habsburgs responded swiftly by rallying Catholic allies, framing the Bohemian Rebellion as a revolt not only against imperial authority, but also against the established religious order. Ferdinand II, newly crowned Holy Roman Emperor, viewed the Bohemian uprising as a test of imperial strength. Determined to assert his authority, he mobilized forces from across his realms. The Catholic League, led by Maximilian of Bavaria, joined the imperial cause. Spanish forces provided additional support. The revolt no longer involved only Bohemia. It had become part of a continent-wide struggle over political control and religious identity. The conflict reached its decisive moment at the Battle of White Mountain, fought just outside Prague. The Bohemian army, though motivated, lacked the discipline, numbers, and experienced leadership of the imperial forces. Frederick's advisors urged caution, but political pressure and poor coordination pushed the rebels into a premature confrontation. The battle lasted only a short time before the Bohemian forces collapsed. Frederick fled Prague, earning the nickname the Winter King, because his reign lasted only a single winter. The defeat at White Mountain marked the end of the Bohemian revolt, but the beginning of a long and painful transformation. The Habsburg victory allowed Ferdinand II to impose sweeping changes throughout the kingdom. Determined to eliminate future rebellion, he initiated a process of recatholicization and political repression that would alter the Czech lands profoundly. One of the first steps taken by the Habsburgs was the confiscation of lands belonging to Protestant nobles. These lands were redistributed to loyal Catholic families, many of whom were of German origin. This policy dramatically altered the social structure of Bohemia. Families who had shaped the kingdom's political and cultural life for generations lost their influence, while newcomers gained power and wealth. This shift contributed to a decline in Czech nobility and expanded German influence in both society and administration. Recatholicization efforts were equally transformative. The Jesuit order played a leading role in restoring Catholic dominance. Schools, churches, and religious institutions promoted Catholic teachings and suppressed dissent. Protestant ministers were expelled, and ordinary citizens were pressured, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, to convert. Many chose exile rather than renounce their beliefs, leading to a significant loss of educated and skilled individuals. These departures not only affected religious life, but also weakened Bohemia's cultural and intellectual heritage. The Habsburgs also imposed German as the dominant administrative language. While Czech continued to be spoken by the majority of the population, its role in public life diminished over time. This contributed to a gradual erosion of Czech cultural identity among the elite. Although the language and traditions survived among common people, they no longer held the same status within the formal structures of power. The impact of the 30 Years' War extended far beyond these early years of repression. As the conflict spread across Europe, it devastated large parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Armies marched through towns and villages, leaving destruction in their wake. Famine, disease, and economic collapse followed. While Bohemia did not experience the worst of the war's devastation, it suffered significant population loss, agricultural decline, and economic hardship. The once prosperous kingdom entered a period of stagnation that lasted for generations. Despite these challenges, the war did not destroy all aspects of cultural life in Bohemia. The Jesuits, while promoting religious conformity, also contributed to education and the arts. Baroque architecture flourished under their influence, and churches, monasteries, and palaces built during this era still stand as remarkable examples of the style. These structures reflect the Habsburgs' desire to present Catholicism as a force of beauty, order, and authority. At the same time, the war's broader political consequences reshaped the European landscape. The Peace of Westphalia, which ended the conflict, established principles that would influence international politics for centuries. It recognized the authority of territorial rulers to determine the religion of their lands. But in Bohemia, this principle meant the complete dominance of Catholicism. The peace also weakened the Holy Roman Empire as a political force. But the Habsburg dynasty retained its strength, continuing to rule over Bohemia with firm control. The Bohemian kingdom that emerged from the 30 Years' War was vastly different from the one that had existed a century earlier. The spirit of reform, debate, and autonomy that had characterized the Hussite period was replaced by centralized control, religious uniformity, and cultural shifts that favored the interests of the Habsburgs. The Czech language and national identity, though not extinguished, retreated into rural villages and family traditions, awaiting later revivals. When the cannons of the 30 Years' War finally fell silent, the Czech lands emerged, changed in ways few could have imagined a century earlier. The once vibrant and politically assertive kingdom shaped by the ideals of the Hussite movement and the ambitions of Renaissance rulers had become a tightly controlled province within the sprawling Habsburg Empire. The defeat of the Bohemian Revolt and the subsequent reordering of society under Ferdinand II had dismantled the old political structure and replaced it with a system rooted in absolutist rule. For the Czech people, this new era brought strict religious conformity, shifting cultural identity, and a profound transformation in how daily life unfolded. At the heart of this transformation was the consolidation of Habsburg authority. The monarchy, which had once negotiated with Bohemian estates and balanced competing religious factions, now exercised near complete control. The Bohemian crown lands were formally declared hereditary possessions of the Habsburg family, a move that eliminated the right of local nobles to elect their king. This shift ended centuries of political autonomy and dissolved the partnership between monarchy and estates that had defined earlier eras. To enforce this new order, Ferdinand II and his successors introduced sweeping reforms designed to ensure loyalty and eliminate dissent. One of the most far-reaching was the redistribution of property. Nobles who had supported the Bohemian Revolt lost their lands, which were awarded to loyal Catholic families, many of them of German origin. This large-scale transfer of wealth reshaped the social hierarchy. Old Czech noble families were replaced or overshadowed by newcomers whose language, culture, and political loyalties aligned with the Habsburg court. The result was a gradual Germanization of the upper classes. German became the dominant language of administration, law, and elite society, while Czech continued to be spoken by the majority of the population, particularly peasants and townspeople. It lost prestige in official settings. Over time, this divide deepened. A German-speaking aristocracy governed a largely Czech-speaking populace, creating cultural barriers that would influence social relations for generations. Religion played a central role in reinforcing Habsburg control. The Catholic Church, empowered by the Counter-Reformation, became an instrument of state authority. Protestant ministers were expelled, and their congregations were pressured to convert. The Jesuits, known for their intellectual discipline and missionary zeal, led efforts to re-educate the population. They established schools, colleges, and seminars across the kingdom. These institutions taught Catholic doctrine, promoted loyalty to the Habsburgs, and cultivated a new generation of priests and scholars. Through these efforts, Catholicism became deeply rooted in public life. Religious festivals filled the calendar, Baroque churches rose in towns and villages, and Catholic rituals shaped community identity. The visual grandeur of Baroque art and architecture, characterized by dramatic shapes, bold ornamentation, and emotional intensity, was meant to inspire devotion and assert the Church's spiritual authority. Paintings, sculptures, and religious displays communicated messages of triumph, sacrifice, and divine grace. These artistic expressions helped reinforce a worldview in which the Habsburg monarchy and the Catholic Church stood as guardians of order and truth. Yet daily life under absolutism was not defined solely by politics and religion. The economy also underwent important changes. Agriculture remained the foundation of society, with most people working as peasants on lands controlled by nobles or church institutions. The burdens of labor were heavy, and serfdom imposed strict obligations. Peasants were required to work for their lords, pay dues, and follow local regulations. Although these conditions existed before the war, the post-war economy placed even greater strain on rural communities. Population losses, destruction of farmland, and a reduced labor force made recovery slow and difficult. Despite these hardships, the Czech lands retained economic significance within the Habsburg Empire. Silver mines, though less productive than in earlier centuries, continued to generate revenue. Craftsmanship and trade revived gradually, helped by the stability that absolutist rule imposed. Towns rebuilt markets, repaired infrastructure, and resumed commercial activity. New industries such as glass-making grew in prominence, eventually becoming symbols of Bohemian craftsmanship, admired across Europe. Urban centers, especially Prague, experienced a cultural and architectural revival during the Baroque period. The city's skyline began to change as churches, palaces, and public buildings were constructed in the ornate Baroque style. Prague Castle underwent renovations that reflected the grandeur of the Habsburg monarchy. The city became a stage where religious processions, theatrical performances, and courtly ceremonies unfolded. These events showcased the wealth and authority of both the monarchy and the church, reminding citizens of the power structures that shaped their lives. Yet beneath the surface of grandeur and restored order, a quiet resilience persisted among the Czech people. The Czech language survived in homes, villages, folk songs, and oral traditions. Although excluded from official administration, it remained alive in everyday speech and local customs. Czech storytellers, musicians, and craftsmen preserved cultural memories that would later fuel a national awakening. Even in a society where power was centralized and cultural expression limited, the roots of Czech identity remained intact. Education became a battleground between cultural suppression and subtle preservation. Jesuit schools emphasized Latin and German, training students for clerical or administrative roles. Yet, many children, especially in rural areas, continued to learn Czech at home. Parish priests, though instructed to promote Catholic orthodoxy, often served as community leaders who maintained local traditions. Literacy grew slowly, and while much of the written material available was religious in nature, it contributed to the spread of learning. This expansion of education, though controlled, laid the groundwork for future intellectual movements. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Czech lands had lived under Habsburg absolutism for generations. The structures of power, language, education, and public life were dominated by German influence, and Czech culture seemed confined to the rural countryside, everyday speech, and the quiet persistence of folk traditions. Yet, beneath this surface, something profound was beginning to stir. An awakening of national consciousness that would reshape the future of the Czech people. This era, often called the Czech National Revival, marked a remarkable transformation, a cultural, linguistic, and intellectual movement that slowly restored a sense of identity long suppressed under imperial rule. The roots of this revival lay in broader European shifts. The Enlightenment encouraged new ideas about human reason, the value of education, and the importance of cultural heritage. Across Europe, scholars and thinkers began studying local languages and histories with renewed interest. Romanticism, which celebrated the spirit of the people, folklore, and national origins, added emotional force to these intellectual movements. In the Czech lands, these trends resonated deeply, especially among educated individuals who realized that their native language and cultural traditions were in danger of disappearing from public life. The first figures of the revival emerged from academic and religious circles. Josef Drovský, often regarded as one of the earliest champions of Czech scholarship, dedicated his life to studying Slavic languages and Czech literary history. He didn't initially seek to restore the Czech language to public prominence, but his meticulous research laid the groundwork for others to follow. By documenting the structure, vocabulary, and history of Czech, he preserved knowledge that would prove essential in revitalizing the language. While Drovský focused on linguistic foundations, their scholar Jef Jungmann took a more ambitious approach. Jungmann believed that Czech could once again become a language of literature, science, and national expression. He translated major works from other European languages into Czech, demonstrating its richness and adaptability. His efforts helped standardize Czech vocabulary and inspired a new generation of writers to embrace their knob tongue. For many, Jungmann became a symbol of intellectual revival, a man determined to prove that Czech culture was not a relic of the past, but a living, evolving force. Alongside these linguistic pioneers, historians and journalists contributed to the movement by reconnecting the Czech people with their past. František Polocký, often honored as the father of the nation, wrote a monumental history of the Czech people that emphasized their unique contributions to Europe. He celebrated the medieval kingdom of Bohemia, the reforms of Jan Hus, and the courage of the Hussite movement. By presenting Czech history as a proud and continuous narrative, Polocký offered his readers a sense of belonging and historical purpose. His work helped counter the widespread belief that Czech culture had been overshadowed or diminished beyond recovery. Newspapers and journals played a vital role in spreading these ideas. Writers such as Karel Havlicek Borovský used journalism to critique oppressive policies, promote political awareness, and encourage readers to think critically about their society. Havlicek wrote with clarity, humor, and a sharp sense of justice, challenging censorship while advocating for greater civic freedoms. His work helped broaden the revival beyond academic circles, making political and cultural issues accessible to ordinary citizens. Education became an essential tool in sustaining the revival. More schools began teaching Czech, and new textbooks appeared that highlighted Czech language, history, and literature. Teachers encouraged pride in local traditions while expanding students' understanding of their cultural heritage. This gradual shift in education empowered younger generations to view Czech identity not as something hidden in rural memory, but as something central to their lives. Folk culture also played an important role. Romantic writers and scholars collected folk songs, stories, and traditions from villages across Bohemia and Moravia. These collections celebrated the creativity and resilience of the common people, presenting Czech folklore as a treasure worthy of preservation. Music especially became a powerful expression of identity. Composers like Bedřich Smetana and later Antonín Dvořák drew inspiration from folk melodies, weaving them into compositions that resonated across Europe. Smetana's works, such as his patriotic tone poem celebrating the Czech landscape, helped translate national pride into artistic form. As cultural confidence grew, the movement expanded into political life. The revolutionary atmosphere of the year 1848 swept through Europe, bringing demands for constitutional reform, political representation, and national rights. In the Czech lands, revival leaders sought recognition within the Habsburg Empire, advocating for Czech autonomy and equal status with German-speaking regions. Palake played a prominent role in these discussions, promoting a vision of empire in which multiple nationalities could coexist under fair governance. He opposed the idea of Czech independence, believing that cooperation within a reformed empire offered the best path forward. Although the revolution ultimately failed to achieve its immediate goals, it marked a turning point. The Czech people demonstrated their capacity for political organization and collective action. The Habsburgs responded with repression at first, but long-term pressures forced gradual reforms, including expanded rights for education, association, and cultural expression. During the latter part of the 19th century, the Czech national revival matured into a fully developed political movement. Czech-language newspapers, theaters, and associations flourished. The National Theatre in Prague became a powerful symbol of cultural pride built through public donations from people across the Czech lands. Its completion represented the triumph of national effort and artistic determination. Political parties formed to champion Czech interests within the empire. These groups demanded greater autonomy, equal representation, and the recognition of Czech as an official language. Their efforts gradually reshaped governance in the Czech lands, leading to administrative reforms and increasing the participation of Czech leaders in imperial politics. Although tensions between Czech and German communities persisted, especially over language, laws, and regional administration, the Czech people gained growing confidence in their cultural and political future. Urbanization and industrialization added new dimensions to the revival. Factories, railways, and expanding cities created a more interconnected society. Workers, students, and professionals joined political clubs and cultural associations, spreading national consciousness across social classes. Prague, once overshadowed by Vienna, emerged as a vibrant center of Czech intellectual and cultural life. Its universities, theaters, cafes, and newspapers nurtured debates about democracy, rights, and national identity. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Czech national revival had reshaped the cultural and political landscape of the Bohemian and Moravian lands. The Czech language had returned to public life. Literature flourished, and political leaders pressed for greater autonomy within the Habsburg Empire. Yet, despite these achievements, the monarchy resisted substantial democratic reform. The empire's complex mixture of nationalities, Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, Hungarians, Poles, Croats, Romanians, and others made it increasingly difficult to manage rising political pressures. When the First World War erupted, these tensions collided with catastrophic force, creating the conditions that would ultimately lead to the birth of a new state, Czechoslovakia. At the beginning of the war, many Czech citizens felt little enthusiasm for the conflict. They did not see it as a struggle that represented their interests. The Habsburg monarchy, seeking to defend its position in Europe, expected loyalty from its subjects, but years of political frustration had eroded Czech trust in imperial leadership. The empire's decision-making was dominated by German and Hungarian elites, leaving Czechs with limited influence over policies that affected their lives. As the war progressed, food shortages, strict censorship, and military losses deepened public discontent. Amid this atmosphere, a few key Czech leaders recognized that the war might offer an opportunity for national independence. One of the most influential figures was Tomáš Gar Masaryk, a former professor and a prominent politician known for his moral integrity and democratic principles. Masaryk believed that the future of the Czech people required the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire. He fled the country during the early years of the war, embarking on a mission to win international support for an independent Czechoslovakia. Masaryk's efforts were joined by Edvard Benes, a skilled diplomat with a sharp understanding of European politics, and Milan Rostislav Stefanik, a Slovak astronomer and military officer who played a crucial role in securing support from the Powers. Together, these three men formed the core leadership of the Czechoslovak resistance, abroad. Their vision extended beyond the Czech lands. They sought to unite Czechs and Slovaks into a single state, believing that cooperation between the two Slavic peoples would create a stronger, more viable nation. A major part of their strategy involved organizing the Czechoslovak legions, military units composed of Czech and Slovak volunteers who fought alongside the Allied armies. These legions took shape in France, Italy, and especially Russia, where they gained international respect for their courage. The exploits of the legions on the Eastern Front demonstrated not only military capability, but also political resolve. They became powerful symbols of national aspiration, proving that Czechs and Slovaks were willing to fight for their own future. Meanwhile, within the Czech lands, wartime hardships intensified. The Habsburg authorities imposed strict controls, punished dissent, and executed activists accused of treason. Yet, the more the empire tightened its grip, the more resistance spread underground. Czech politicians within the imperial parliament, though constrained by censorship, worked quietly to prepare for the moment when change might become possible. Workers, students, and intellectuals held private meetings, discussed national rights, and circulated banned writings. Even rural communities felt the growing desire for self-determination. The turning point came when the war began to unravel for the Central Powers. Military defeats, economic collapse, and internal unrest weakened Austria-Hungary beyond repair. National groups throughout the empire demanded independence. Poles, Slavs, Romanians, and others began declaring their own states. The empire, long held together through political maneuvering and imperial prestige, could no longer contain the centrifugal force of national movements. For the Czech and Slovak leaders abroad, this was the moment they had anticipated. Masaryk traveled tirelessly, meeting with world leaders and advocating for the recognition of a new Czechoslovak nation. Banished negotiated with diplomats, drafting documents, attending conferences, and ensuring that the Allied powers understood the legitimacy of the Czech and Slovak claim to self-rule. Stefanik, working within military circles, secured crucial support from French officials and helped coordinate legion activities. Their combined efforts paid off. The Allied powers gradually accepted the idea of Czechoslovakia as a future independent state. The Czechoslovak National Council formed abroad. As a provisional government gained diplomatic recognition, legions fighting on the Allied side strengthened the case for independence, demonstrating national commitment through direct participation in the war. Inside the Czech lands, the final collapse of imperial authority came swiftly. In the autumn of the war's last year, Austria-Hungary could no longer maintain order. Strikes spread across cities, soldiers deserted in large numbers, and food shortages led to widespread unrest. Political leaders in Prague sensed that the moment had come to act. They declared the formation of the Czechoslovak National Committee, which assumed control of the region's administration. In a remarkably peaceful transition of power, Czech leaders took control of government buildings, post offices, railways, and military garrisons. The Habsburg authorities, overwhelmed by the empire's collapse, offered little resistance. Crowds gathered in the streets to celebrate, waving Czech flags and singing patriotic songs that had once been suppressed under imperial rule. The sense of relief and joy was immense. After centuries of foreign domination, the Czech people now faced the dawn of self-government. At nearly the same moment abroad, Masaryk announced the formation of an independent Czechoslovak Republic. The international community recognized the new state, and Masaryk returned triumphantly to Prague. Greeted by enthusiastic crowds, he was elected the first president of Czechoslovakia, a role he shaped according to his ideals of democracy, equality, and moral responsibility. With the proclamation of Czechoslovakia, a new chapter opened for the peoples of Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia, and Slovakia. After centuries under dynastic rule, they finally possessed a state shaped not by imperial decree, but by democratic principles and national aspirations. The first Czechoslovak Republic quickly earned a reputation as one of the most stable and progressive democracies in interwar Europe. Yet beneath its successes lay challenges that demanded careful navigation: ethnic diversity, regional inequalities, economic pressures, and the rising threats posed by extremist movements beyond its borders. From the beginning, the Republic's founders, most notably President Tomáš Masaryk and Foreign Minister Edward Benes, sought to establish a political system rooted in democratic ideals. They believed that the new state should reflect the values of political pluralism, individual rights, and civic responsibility. Their constitution emphasized the separation of powers, protection of minorities, and parliamentary governance. These principles guided the Republic's development, shaping its institutions and public life. Prague, already a historic cultural center, now became the vibrant capital of a democratic nation. Government ministries, universities, theaters, and scientific institutes expanded their roles, contributing to a lively public discourse. The city attracted intellectuals, artists, and political thinkers from across Europe, becoming a hub of innovation and cultural exchange. Cafes buzzed with debate, newspapers multiplied, and academic societies flourished. It was a period of remarkable intellectual energy. One of the great strengths of the new state was its economy. The Czech lands, especially Bohemia and Moravia, possessed some of the most advanced industries in Central Europe. They produced machinery, textiles, glass, and chemicals, and the famed works became a symbol of modern industrial capability. Slovakia and Runia, by contrast, remained more rural and less developed, but the government invested in improving infrastructure, education, and public services to reduce regional disparities. Although unequal development created tensions between Saxons and Slovaks, the overall economic performance of the Republic remained strong throughout much of its early existence. Cultural life thrived as well. Czech literature reached new heights with writers who explored modern themes of identity, psychology, and social change. Playwrights, poets, and novelists contributed to a flourishing artistic scene. In music, composers such as Laus, Janacek advanced new styles that gained international recognition. Prague's theaters and concert halls reflected a society eager to express itself creatively. The Republic's democratic openness also allowed political parties to operate freely. Parties representing Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, Hungarians, Jews, and other groups contested elections and participated in parliamentary debate. While this diversity created a vibrant political landscape, it also made governing more complex. Coalitions were necessary to form stable governments, and disagreements among parties sometimes hindered reforms. Nevertheless, compared to many neighboring states that succumbed to authoritarianism, Czechoslovakia maintained a functioning democracy. The issue of national minorities, however, remained a persistent challenge. Germans formed a significant portion of the population, especially in the border regions known as the Sudetenland. Many of these communities had prospered under the Habsburgs and felt uncertain within the new republic, where political power was dominated by Czechs and Slovaks. Although the constitution guaranteed minority rights, tensions grew over language laws, administrative appointments, and economic policies. Similar issues affected Hungarian minorities in Slovakia and Runia, though the German question became the most significant. Internationally, the Republic sought security through alliances. Edvard Beneš, serving as foreign minister, played a pivotal role in shaping Czechoslovakia's diplomatic strategy. He forged connections with France and later with other Central European states through the Little Ant, a regional alliance aimed at preventing the restoration of the Habsburg monarchy and resisting aggression from neighboring powers. Beneš believed that strong international partnerships were essential for preserving the Republic's independence in a region marked by shifting political forces. Despite its internal and external challenges, the First Czechoslovak Republic remained a beacon of democracy in a troubled era. As authoritarian regimes rose in Italy, Poland, Hungary, and later Germany, Czechoslovakia stood out as a functioning parliamentary state committed to liberal values. Its press remained relatively free, its elections competitive, and its civic institutions active. Mazaryk's moral leadership played a decisive role. Often called the President Liberator, he embodied the spirit of the Republic, emphasizing fairness, moderation, and dialogue. Yet, no democracy exists in isolation, and the political storm gathering in Europe would soon test the Republic's resilience. The rise of an extremist movement in Germany dramatically altered the political climate. Propaganda targeting the Sudeten Germans intensified, exploiting economic grievances and feelings of marginalization. Many Sudeten Germans faced unemployment during the global economic crisis, and extremist leaders capitalized on these hardships by accusing the Prague government of discrimination. The global depression further weakened the Republic. Export industries suffered, unemployment grew, and political tensions sharpened. Although the government took steps to stabilize the economy, the crisis undermined confidence in democratic institutions. In the Sudetenland, the Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henland, gained widespread support by promising to defend German interests and align with the rising power across the border. Mazaryk's resignation due to old age marked the end of an era. Edvard Beneš succeeded him as president, bringing diplomatic skill but lacking the moral authority that Masaryk had enjoyed. Beneš faced an increasingly hostile international environment where aggressive states pursued expansion and democratic nations struggled to respond. The collapse of the First Czechoslovak Republic was not the result of internal failure alone, but of external forces that reshaped Europe in the years leading up to the Second World War. The Munich Agreement, negotiated without Czechoslovak representation, exposed the deep flaws of appeasement and demonstrated how the ambitions of a totalitarian state could undermine even the most stable of democracies. What followed was a period of profound suffering, resistance and transformation for the Czech lands as they endured foreign occupation and became a battleground for competing visions of power and human dignity. After the Munich decision forced Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland to Germany, the Republic's very foundations began to crumble. Sudeten border regions, home to many of the country's defensive fortifications, had protected the Czech heartland for decades. Their loss left the remaining territory vulnerable to further aggression. In addition, the economic blow was severe. Industries, mines, and transportation routes located in the Sudetenland were vital to Snorts and music, the national economy. Without them, the already weakened republic struggled to maintain stability. In the months that followed, political chaos spread. Slovakia sought greater autonomy, eventually breaking away under pressure from Germany. Carpathian Ruthenia declared independence only to be swiftly seized by Hungary. These developments left the Czechlands isolated and exposed. President Edvard Beneš, deeply discouraged by the betrayal of Allied democracies, resigned and went into exile. His departure symbolized the end of the independent state that he and Masaryk had helped build. The final blow came when German troops marched into the remaining Czech territory. The region was transformed into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a puppet territory controlled directly from Berlin. A German-appointed Richter supervised the administration, and the Czech government that remained had little real authority. The occupation brought not only the loss of sovereignty, but the imposition of a brutal system designed to suppress Czech identity and exploit the population for the German war effort. Initially, German authorities sought a cautious approach, hoping to maintain order by presenting a facade of stability. They allowed limited cultural activity and retained some Czech officials in administrative roles. Yet beneath this surface lay a clear intention to Germanize the region and eliminate any potential for resistance. Factories were repurposed to support the German military. Labor was tightly controlled, and political dissent was crushed swiftly. The arrival of Reinhard Heydrich as acting Reich protector marked a decisive shift toward harsher rule. Heydrich, a key architect of the Nazi regime's oppressive policies, sought to accelerate the process of domination. He ordered mass arrests, dissolved cultural associations, and intensified surveillance. His regime targeted intellectuals, political leaders, and members of the resistance. Universities in Prague and Brno were closed, and many students were imprisoned or executed. Heydrich believed that by destroying Czech leadership and instilling fear, he could secure long-term control of the region. Yet, repression did not extinguish the spirit of resistance. From the earliest days of occupation, small groups formed networks to distribute information, sabotage German operations, and assist those persecuted by the regime. These groups often operated in secrecy, using radio transmitters to communicate with the government in exile, led by Edvard Beneš in London. The exiled government coordinated with Allied powers, working to support resistance efforts inside the Protectorate. One of the most dramatic acts of resistance was Operation Anthropoid, a British-backed mission carried out by Czechoslovak soldiers trained abroad. Their goal was to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich, whose cruelty had earned him the nickname the Butcher of Prague. The operatives, Jan Kubiš and Yusuf Gopčík, ambushed Heydrich's car in Prague, fatally wounding him. The act shocked the Nazi leadership and demonstrated the courage of those fighting for Czech freedom. The German response was swift and devastating. In retaliation, the village of Litis was destroyed completely. Men were executed. Women and children were sent to concentration camps, and the village itself was razed to the ground. This brutal act was intended as a warning to others, reinforcing the dangers of distance. Yet, instead of breaking Czech morale, it strengthened international sympathy for the Czechoslovak cause and highlighted the extreme measures the Nazis were willing to take. The persecution of Jewish communities under Nazi rule was equally horrific. Jewish citizens from Bohemia and Moravia were stripped of their rights, subjected to discriminatory laws, and eventually deported to ghettos and concentration camps. Many were sent to the Theresian ghetto, located within the Czech lands, which the regime used as a propaganda tool to deceive the world about the true nature of its policies. In reality, Theresian served as a transit camp, and countless deports were later transported to extermination camps. The loss of life was staggering, and entire communities were destroyed. Despite these tragedies, acts of cultural resistance persisted. Czech artists, writers, and musicians found subtle ways to preserve national identity. Secret concerts, underground publications, and coded symbols of defiance circulated quietly, reminding people of their shared heritage and hopes for the future. Even during the darkest years, the Czech language, traditions, and sense of community survived. As the war turned against Germany, the situation in the Protectorate shifted once again. Allied bombing campaigns targeted industrial centers, disrupting production and weakening the German war effort. Resistance groups increased their activities, sabotaging railways, distributing leaflets, and gathering intelligence. The approaching Soviet and American armies signaled that liberation might be near, though uncertainty remained about what form that liberation would take. The end of the Second World War brought liberation to Czechoslovakia, but it also placed the nation at the crossroads of a rapidly changing Europe. The destruction left by war demanded urgent rebuilding, yet the future of the region was clouded by rising tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. These tensions soon into the global divide, known as the Cold War. Czechoslovakia, lying between East and West, found itself increasingly drawn into the Soviet sphere of influence, a shift that would ultimately transform its political system, society, and everyday life. In the first months after liberation, many citizens hoped to restore the ideals of the First Republic. Edvard Beneš returned from exile, democratic institutions were revived, and political parties resumed activity. Yet the balance of power had changed dramatically. The Soviet Union, whose armies had liberated much of the country, exercised immense influence. The Czechoslovak Communist Party, which had been relatively small before the war, now emerged with strong support. Its leaders, including Klement Gottwald, positioned themselves as champions of social justice, workers' rights, and national security at a time when the nation was eager for stability. The immediate post-war government formed a coalition that included communists, social democrats, national socialists, and other groups. While this arrangement appeared democratic, the communists skillfully used their position to strengthen their influence. They controlled key ministries, such as the Interior and Information, which allowed them to shape police forces, public messaging, and media narratives. The party also benefited from widespread public admiration for the Soviet Union, whose sacrifices during the war had earned deep respect. Land reforms further increased communist support. Large estates were confiscated from former German property owners and collaborators, then redistributed to Czech and Slovak farmers. Many people welcomed these changes, seeing them as a necessary step toward social fairness. The communists also promoted industrial nationalization, arguing that key sectors should be placed under public ownership to prevent economic exploitation. Despite these developments, Czechoslovakia's political system remained pluralistic for a brief time. Elections were held, debates took place in parliament, and President Beneš attempted to preserve democratic norms. However, the Cold War intensified quickly and pressure from Moscow increased. The Soviet Union sought to secure a buffer of friendly states along its western border and viewed Czechoslovakia's democracy as a potential obstacle. The communists inside the country recognized that international conditions favored a decisive push for full control. The critical moment arrived during a political crisis, often called the February coup. Several non-communist ministers resigned from the government in protest against communist tactics, hoping to force new elections. Instead, their resignation gave Gottwald the opportunity to demand that President Beneš appoint a new government dominated by the communists. Mass demonstrations organized by the party filled the streets, and armed workers' militias appeared, creating an atmosphere of intimidation. Beneš, weakened by illness and lacking support from the Western Allies, reluctantly agreed. The communist takeover was completed without violent conflict. Yet, its consequences were profound and lasting. With communist rule firmly established, Czechoslovakia entered a new era aligned closely with Moscow. The government rapidly transformed the state into a socialist republic based on Soviet political models. Opposition parties were dissolved, private property was nationalized, and the press came under strict state control. The secret police, known for their extensive surveillance and harsh interrogation methods, became a central instrument of the regime, targeting political opponents, intellectuals, clergy, and anyone suspected of dissent. Show trials modeled after those in the Soviet Union were staged to intimidate the population and eliminate rivals within the Communist Party itself. High-ranking officials, military leaders, and scholars were accused of treason, espionage, or sabotage. Many were imprisoned, executed, or sent to labor camps. These trials reinforced the climate of fear, ensuring that loyalty to the party remained unquestioned. Economic restructuring followed the Soviet model as well. The government introduced centralized planning, focusing heavily on heavy industry, steel production, mining, and military equipment. Consumer goods, housing, and agriculture often received less attention, leading to shortages and inefficiencies. Workers were encouraged to meet production targets through state-sponsored campaigns, and success was often rewarded with public recognition. Yet, productivity frequently suffered from unrealistic goals, mismanagement, and lack of incentives. Rural life also underwent dramatic transformation. Farms were collectivized, with private landowners pressured or forced to join large agricultural cooperatives. This policy disrupted traditional farming practices and often met resistance, particularly in Slovakia, where small family farms were common. While collectivization increased state control over food production, it also caused resentment and sometimes reduced agricultural output. Daily life under the communist regime was shaped by ideological expectations. Schools taught Marxist-Leninist doctrine emphasizing loyalty to the party and the Soviet Union. Textbooks were rewritten to portray history through a class struggle narrative, diminishing the significance of earlier democratic traditions and national heroes who did not fit the ideological line. Children joined youth organizations that promoted socialist values, which lay adults were encouraged to participate in workplace committees and social clubs aligned with party goals. Despite these restrictions, society remained active and creative in many areas. Science and engineering benefited from state investment, particularly in heavy industry, mathematics, and technical fields. Cultural life persisted, though closely monitored. Writers, filmmakers, and artists learned to navigate censorship, sometimes embedding criticism in allegory or symbolism. Others chose silence or faced punishment for defying ideological boundaries. Religion faced significant pressure under the regime. Churches were placed under state supervision. Clergy were monitored, and religious education was restricted. Yet, faith communities survived, often finding ways to adapt or practice quietly. In some cases, religious leaders became symbols of moral resistance to the regime's control. Internationally, Czechoslovakia became one of the more industrially developed states in the Eastern Bloc. Its factories and skilled workforce contributed significantly to the economic network overseen by the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, a Soviet-led organization coordinating trade among socialist states. However, reliance on Soviet markets and isolation from Western innovation eventually limited growth and competitiveness. By the early 1960s, Czechoslovakia stood at a crossroads. The rigid structures of Stalinist rule, imposed during the early years of the communist regime, were showing clear signs of strain. Heavy industry had been prioritized at the expense of consumer needs. Agricultural collectivization had weakened rural productivity, and intellectual life suffered under strict censorship. Many citizens sensed that the system was failing to keep pace with the realities of a modern society. Beneath the surface, a quiet but persistent desire for reform began to take root among economists, writers, students, and even members of the Communist Party itself. Among those advocating change were economists who recognized that centralized planning had created inefficiencies, shortages, and stagnation. They argued that the state needed to decentralize decision-making, encourage innovation, and allow businesses greater flexibility. Writers and artists demanded the freedom to express ideas honestly, believing that creativity could not flourish under censorship. Students and youth groups voiced frustration over limited opportunities and the lack of political openness. Even within the Communist Party, reform-minded officials questioned whether strict ideological control was compatible with long-term social progress. These internal pressures culminated in a leadership change. Alexander Dubek, a Slovak communist, known for his humane approach and willingness to embrace reform, ascended to the position of first secretary. Dubec believed that socialism could evolve into a more democratic and participatory system, one that respected human dignity and encouraged creativity while maintaining social equality. His vision became known as socialism with a human face, a phrase that captured the hopes of millions. Under Dubec's leadership, reforms unfolded swiftly. Censorship was relaxed, allowing newspapers, journals, and writers to address issues previously considered taboo. Public debates flourished, and citizens discussed political ideas openly in cafes, universities, and workplaces. The media began to expose past injustices, including political trials and abuses of power. These revelations shocked many, but also inspired a sense of moral renewal. For the first time in the decades, citizens felt that the government was willing to confront its own failures. Economic reforms also progressed. Enterprises gained more autonomy in planning productio, setting wages and managing resources. The goal was to create a more efficient, responsive economy that could improve living standards. Workers were encouraged to participate in decision-making, fostering a sense of ownership and responsibility. While these changes did not fully dismantle the socialist system, they introduced elements of flexibility that had long been absent. Cultural life blossomed during this period. Filmmakers, playwrights, and novelists produced works that explored complex themes of identity, freedom, and morality. The Czech New Wave in cinema emerged as one of the most influential artistic movements of the era, producing films that used humor, symbolism, and realism to examine the human condition. Music, theater, and visual arts enjoyed a similar surge of creativity. Prague became a city alive with optimism and intellectual excitement. The Prague Spring, as this reform movement came to be called, captured attention around the world. Many admired Czechoslovakia's effort to create a more open and democratic form of socialism. However, leaders of the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc states viewed the reforms with alarm. They feared that the loosening of controls in Czechoslovakia could inspire similar movements elsewhere, threatening the unity and authority of the socialist bloc. To them, Dubec's experiment represented a dangerous precedent. Throughout the spring and summer, tensions mounted. Soviet leaders pressured Dubec to reverse the reforms, demanding assurances that Czechoslovakia would remain firmly aligned with the Eastern Bloc. Dubec attempted to reassure them, insisting that reforms were intended to strengthen socialism, not undermine it. Yet his refusal to restore censorship or halt political liberalization convinced Soviet officials that decisive action was needed. In the late summer of that year, troops for care on the Soviet Union and several Warsaw Pact nations crossed into Czechoslovakia. Tanks rolled through Prague, Bratislava, and other major cities. Soldiers occupied government buildings, radio stations, and public squares. The invasion stunned the world and shocked the Czechoslovak population, who responded with widespread but peaceful resistance. Citizens confronted soldiers with protest signs, argued with them in the streets, and removed road signs to confuse military convoys. Radio broadcasts urged calm while denouncing the violation of national sovereignty. Dubec and other reform leaders were arrested and transported to Moscow for interrogation. Although they were eventually allowed to return, they were forced to accept a new political reality. The reforms of the Prague Spring would be reversed. The dream of a more democratic socialism had been crushed by overwhelming military force. With the suppression of the Prague Spring, a period known as normalization began. This era, overseen by leaders such as Gustav Husak, sought to restore strict communist control and eliminate the reforms that had emerged under Dubec. Censorship returned with renewed severity. Writers, intellectuals, and artists who had spoken freely during the spring were silenced. Many lost their jobs, were expelled from professional organizations, or became subjects of constant surveillance. The secret police expanded their activities, monitoring citizens, infiltrating dissident groups, and maintaining detailed records on public behavior. Political loyalty became essential for career advancement. Those who cooperated enjoyed stability, but those who resisted faced marginalization, intimidation, or arrest. The sense of openness and possibility that had defined the Prague Spring gave way to an atmosphere of caution and mistrust in the economy. Reforms were rolled back. Centralized planning, reforms were rolled back, assumed with a renewed focus on meeting production quotas rather than improving efficiency or quality of life. Although the state achieved moderate economic stability, innovation stagnated, consumer goods remained in short supply, and shortages became part of daily life. The earlier promise of economic revitalization faded as bureaucratic control tightened once again. Yet, even in this restrictive environment, dissent did not disappear entirely. One of the most significant acts of resistance emerged in the form of Charter 177, a document signed by intellectuals, artists, and activists calling for the government to uphold human rights commitments it had agreed to under international treaties. The Charter movement, though small, symbolized the persistence of moral and political opposition. Its signatories faced persecution, yet their courage inspired others to question the legitimacy of the regime. Students, too, played a role in maintaining a spirit of resistance. Demonstrations, though quickly suppressed, reflected the ongoing desire for freedom and reform. Underground publications circulated clandestinely, keeping alive conversations about democracy, culture, and national identity. Musicians and theater groups used subtle symbolism to express dissent, reminding audiences that critique could survive even under censorship. In daily life, citizens developed strategies to navigate the constraints of normalization. Private gatherings, family traditions, and quiet conversations offered separacy of authenticity, away from the watchful eyes of the state. Many people retreated into personal pursuits, gardening, hiking, literature, and music, finding solace in the natural beauty of the Czech landscape or the comfort of shared cultural memories. These small acts of personal resilience preserved a sense of dignity in an era marked by political conformity. By the close of the 198 0s, the political landscape of Central and Eastern Europe was shifting rapidly. Decades of authoritarian rule had produced widespread dissatisfaction, and the rigid structures of the Soviet-backed regimes were cracking under economic stagnation, loss of legitimacy, and rising public frustration. In Czechoslovakia, the memory of the Prague Spring lingered as both a wound and an inspiration. Many citizens still envisioned a society built on openness, dignity, and democratic participation. As new movements for reform spread across the socialist world, the Czech and Slovak peoples sensed that a historic turning point was approaching. The spark that ignited change in Czechoslovakia came from a growing wave of protests, dissident activities, and civic initiatives. Intellectuals, who had long been marginalized under normalization, continued to distribute underground publications, perform band theater, and host private seminars. Students and young workers formed independent groups that questioned the official narrative. One of the most influential voices in this era was Václav Havel, a playwright whose works challenged the absurdities of authoritarian rule. Havel and other dissidents had helped create Charter 177, a document demanding that the government honor human rights obligations. Though its signatories faced harassment, dismissal from jobs, and imprisonment, the Charter movement laid the groundwork for a broader civic awakening. By the late 1980s, international conditions favored change. Reformist leaders in the Soviet Union introduced policies encouraging openness and restructuring, weakening the old mechanisms of control across the Eastern Bloc. Meanwhile, peaceful revolutions unfolded in neighboring states, inspiring Czech and Slovak citizens to believe that transformation was possible. In this environment of rising expectation, even small acts of defiance gained significance. The decisive moment arrived when a student demonstration in Prague, held to commemorate a historical event, was violently suppressed by police. News of the crackdown spread rapidly, sparking outrage throughout the country. Citizens flooded the streets in growing numbers, calling for political freedom, democratic reforms, and an end to the communist regime. Actors went on strike, theaters turned into public forums, and universities became centers of debate. Millions of people watched as events unfolded, feeling a mix of fear, hope, and determination. What made the movement remarkable was its commitment to nonviolence. Protesters rang keys as a symbol of opening a new era, carried candles in quiet vigils, and treated even the police with restraint. The atmosphere of peaceful unity earned the movement the name Velvet Revolution, a reference to the softness and dignity with which citizens resisted authoritarian power. Under mounting pressure, the communist leadership resigned, and negotiations began to form a new government. Václav Havel emerged as one of the central figures in the transition. His moral authority, long shaped by years of persecution and resistance, made him a trusted voice for democratic change. The newly formed Civic Forum, a broad coalition of activists, intellectuals, and reform-minded citizens, selected Havel as a leader. Within weeks, he was elected president of Czechoslovakia, marking the triumph of civic courage over decades of suppression. With the fall of the communist regime, the nation faced the enormous task of rebuilding political institutions, reforming the economy, and redefining its place in the world. The transition from a centrally planned system to a market economy required both bold decisions and careful management. Factories were privatized, markets opened, and new laws introduced to support entrepreneurship and foreign investment. These changes brought economic opportunity, but also hardship. While some citizens thrived under the new system, others struggled to adapt to unemployment, price increases, and uncertainty. The process was challenging, but it set the foundation for long-term economic growth. Politically, Czechoslovakia embraced multi-party democracy. Elections were held, offering citizens genuine political choice for the first time in decades. Civil society expanded rapidly as new organizations, associations, and media outlets emerged. Freedom of speech, assembly, and religion became protected rights once again. Though the early years of transition were marked by intense debate and occasional instability, the country successfully rebuilt its democratic institutions. Yet, one of the most complex questions concerned the relationship between Czechs and Slovaks. While united by shared history and struggle, the two peoples had distinct identities, economic structures, and political visions. Differences that had been suppressed under previous regimes now emerged openly. Some Slovak leaders felt that the central government favored Czech interests, while many in the Czech lands believed that the federation could not function effectively with two diverging political systems. Negotiations intensified, and political leaders from both sides debated the future of the federation. Václav Klaus, a prominent Czech economic reformer, and Vladimir Matia, a leading Slovak politician, became key figures in the discussions. Ultimately, both sides agreed that an amicable separation would serve their respective interests better than a forced unity. The process was careful, deliberate, and remarkably peaceful, reflecting the spirit of dialogue that had characterized for a Velvet Revolution itself. On the first day of January, in the early 1990s, the country officially divided into two independent states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. This event became known as the Velvet Divorce. Unlike many national separations marked by conflict or violence, the split unfolded with negotiation and mutual respect. Both nations retained close cultural ties and later joined the European Union, further strengthening their relationship. Following independence, the Czech Republic began shaping its modern identity. Prague, with its historic architecture, vibrant cultural life, and growing tourism industry, became one of the most admired capitals in Europe. The country made significant progress in integrating into Western political and economic structures. It joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, affirming its commitment to collective security, and later entered the European Union, gaining access to broader markets, educational opportunities, and international cooperation. Economically, the Czech Republic continued to modernize. The transition to a market economy brought foreign investment, encouraged technological innovation, and revitalized industries such as automotive manufacturing, electronics, and engineering. As living standards improved, cities expanded, infrastructure developed, and new cultural institutions flourished. Czech filmmakers, authors, scientists, and athletes earned international recognition, contributing to a renewed sense of national pride. Politically, the country strengthened its democratic processes. Elections remained competitive, political parties diverse, and media free. While the Czech Republic, like any modern democracy, faced challenges, corruption scandals, shifting political coalitions, and debates over economic inequality, it remained committed to open discourse and constitutional governance. Václav Havel continued to play a symbolic role, urging citizens to value truth, responsibility, and human rights. As the decades progressed, new leaders emerged. Václav Klaus, Miloš Zeman, and later presidents and prime ministers guided the nation through evolving domestic and international issues. Disagreements over European integration, relations with neighboring states, and social policy reflected a mature political landscape in which multiple perspectives could coexist. Through each transition, the Czech Republic maintained a stable democratic foundation. Drawing strength from the Kůš champion during the Velvet Revolution, culturally, the country embraced both its deep historical roots and its modern identity. Festivals, literature, music, and art celebrated Czech heritage while also engaging with global influences. Universities expanded research programs, attracting international scholars. Technology companies and startups flourished. Tourism became a major industry, drawing millions to Prague, Český Krumlov, and other historic sites. Today, the Czech Republic stands as a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the enduring power of peaceful transformation. From medieval kingdoms and religious conflicts to imperial domination, national revival, world wars, communist repression, and revolutionary change, the nation has continually reshaped itself in response to the challenges of history. The story of the Czech people is one of continuity and reinvention, rooted in tradition, yet open to new ideas, shaped by struggle, yet defined by perseverance. The Velvet Revolution and the peaceful separation into two independent states marked not an end, but a beginning. In the modern era, the Czech Republic continues to build on its rich heritage while forging a dynamic path forward in an interconnected world.